Algiers, 1957. The war for Algeria's independence had reached its most violent phase, and France's military command was losing control of both the streets and the story. Bombings, assassinations, and retaliations had turned the colonial capital into a city under siege. The French army, desperate to dismantle the National Liberation Front, or FLN, began using any method that promised results. Officially, France denied using torture. Unofficially, the entire counterinsurgency campaign relied on it. The system didn't appear overnight. It grew quietly inside the machinery of colonial administration, an invisible web of laws, military orders, and secret detention centers. When the rebellion began in 1954, the government in Paris framed it as a matter of policing within French territory, not a war between nations. That legal fiction gave the army enormous freedom. No war, no prisoners of war, no Geneva Conventions. Algerians captured in raids were simply suspects, stripped of rights and moved into military custody without record. Within a year, French commanders discovered that mass arrests were ineffective unless they could extract information quickly. They called it interrogation under constraint. In practice, it meant electricity, drowning, and beatings. The paratroopers who had fought in Indochina brought with them a new doctrine: total control of the population through fear. Units established centers de triage, or sorting centers, where civilians were questioned before being sent either to internment camps or to their deaths. The line between intelligence gathering and punishment blurred completely. The Battle of Algiers turned those methods into a coordinated system. General Jacques Massou's 10th Parachute Division was given full powers to restore order in the capital. Raids took place nightly. Suspects vanished into villas and cellars converted into makeshift prisons. The military headquarters on Rue Caton and several hidden basements across Algiers became infamous among those who survived. Electric generators were hooked to field telephones to deliver shocks. Detainees were hung from pipes, submerged in water, deprived of sleep, and beaten for hours. Few civilians dared speak about it publicly. Those who did were threatened or rearrested. Inside the army, officers referred to the procedure as le système. It operated with bureaucratic precision: arrest, isolate, interrogate, extract confession, report to intelligence. Files were coded and circulated to higher command, often reaching Paris within days. Each district had its designated teams trained in special questioning. They were told their mission was to save lives by preventing bombings, a moral shield that transformed cruelty into duty. Torture became not an aberration, but a daily administrative act. At the time, French newspapers were heavily censored. Reporters who hinted at abuse had their articles pulled. The Ministry of Information labeled claims of torture as communist propaganda. But rumors spread among soldiers returning from Algeria. Some, disturbed by what they had witnessed, began speaking privately. Young conscripts described prisoners suspended from rafters, others taken away and never seen again. Priests serving as chaplains sent letters to bishops warning that the soul of France is being destroyed in the cellars of Algiers. Most of those letters were buried. In 1958, the silence cracked. Henri Alleg, editor of the left-wing newspaper Algers Républicain, published a short book detailing his experience under interrogation by paratroopers. He named locations, described electric torture, and reproduced the language of his interrogators, who insisted they were following orders. The book La Question was immediately banned, yet it circulated secretly in Paris and caused a national scandal. For the first time, the public glimpse of systematic torture forced the government to react. Ministers denied everything. The military defended its methods, and Alleg was dismissed as a traitor. But the book had revealed the existence of something too organized to be random. Over the next months, independent lawyers, doctors, and journalists began collecting testimonies from detainees. Their reports showed consistent patterns: identical torture methods used in separate regions, similar phrasing in interrogation notes, and identical bureaucratic forms bearing army stamps. The evidence pointed to a centralized policy disguised as emergency policing. Behind each case lay the same chain of command, from field units to intelligence officers to generals who received results without asking how they were obtained. When the war finally ended in 1962, France tried to bury the past under silence. Amnesties protected most soldiers and officials from prosecution. Archives were sealed, witnesses intimidated, and the official narrative reframed the conflict as a tragedy of excesses committed on both sides. But Algerians who survived the cellars remembered names, faces, and screams. In their neighborhoods, people still whispered about relatives who had been taken during the night and never returned. To them, torture had not been an exception. It had been the law itself, enforced by a state that called itself civilized. For decades afterward, successive French governments refused to recognize any policy of torture. They admitted some abuses, but insisted the Republic never authorized them. It would take more than half a century before that wall of denial began to crack. Only when aging veterans and historians exposed official documents did the truth begin to emerge. That France had built, funded, and maintained a secret torture system that operated from the highest levels of command down to the smallest police cell. When the French army took full control of counterinsurgency operations in Algeria, it did so with the blessing of Paris. In January 1957, the civil authorities of Algiers handed over all policing powers to the military. It was an extraordinary decision, effectively placing a European city under martial law inside what France claimed was still its own territory. For the generals, it was a green light to wage an unrestricted war against the FLN. For ordinary Algerians, it marked the start of an invisible dictatorship, where no law, no court, and no appeal could protect them once arrested. Every street, cafe, and courtyard became a potential trap. Military patrols carried lists compiled by informants and intelligence units. Names were checked, doors kicked in, men blindfolded and dragged away. Officially, detainees were being questioned for their ties to terrorism. In reality, many were picked up simply because someone had whispered their name. Entire neighborhoods, especially the Kasbah, lived under curfew and collective punishment. The paratroopers installed command posts and interrogation rooms in confiscated houses. What began as an emergency operation evolved into a machinery of control that functioned around the clock. French officers wrote reports describing interrogation success rates. Torture was recorded not as a crime, but as efficiency. They spoke of technical sessions, psychological pressures, and accelerated questioning. Inside those euphemisms lay a standardized procedure: electricity, beatings, simulated drowning, and confinement in total darkness until the prisoner broke. Some detainees were released to spread fear. Others were quietly executed and dumped into ravines or buried in unmarked graves. Many were listed as missing or escaped, their deaths erased by paperwork. The system was not improvised. It was organized through formal structures known as DOPs, Dispositifs Opérationnels de Protection. These were military interrogation centers created across Algeria, each supervised by officers trained in counterinsurgency. The DOPs operated under dual control. Intelligence officers collected information, while the army handled physical persuasion. Behind the barbed wire and whitewashed walls, thousands of Algerians passed through these centers, often never to return. Testimonies from survivors years later described the same instruments everywhere: hand-cranked field telephones wired to the body, buckets of filthy water for immersion, and wooden sticks for beatings. At Bastion 18 in Tlemcen, at the police headquarters in Constantine, in the cellars of Blida and Oran, the pattern repeated itself. The same questions, the same devices, the same silence. French doctors were occasionally present, ordered to revive detainees so that sessions could continue. Clergymen who visited the prisons later testified that the smell of burned skin and electricity lingered in the corridors. Some soldiers, traumatized by what they witnessed, wrote to superiors or to family describing the horror. But those letters were censored, and many careers ended abruptly for those who spoke too loudly. The justifications were always the same. Officers insisted they were fighting terrorism, that their methods prevented bombings, that lives were being saved. They framed torture as a grim necessity, a dirty job required to protect civilians. In the language of official communique, they were restoring order. The paradox was striking. A republic built on liberty and human rights had created an internal secret police system more brutal than anything it had condemned in Europe only a decade earlier. While most of the French public remained unaware, a few voices in Paris began to question what was happening. Journalists from L'Express, lawyers from the Federation of Human Rights, and members of the clergy collected testimonies from refugees arriving in France. They spoke of electrocution, sexual violence, and disappearances. The government dismissed the reports as exaggerated, but the evidence kept growing. Names of officers, lists of missing persons, coded documents leaked from army archives. One of the most striking cases was that of Maurice Audin, a young French-Algerian mathematician and communist sympathizer. Arrested by paratroopers in June 1957, he was accused of aiding the FLN. 10 days later, the army announced he had escaped during transfer. His body was never found. For decades, his wife Josette campaigned to uncover the truth, writing letters to every administration that came and went. Witnesses eventually confirmed what she always knew, that Audin had died under torture during interrogation in an army villa. His death became a symbol of the Republic's silence. Internally, some officers began to question the moral cost. General de Bollardière, a decorated paratrooper, publicly denounced the use of torture and resigned in protest. He was ostracized, court-martialed, and sidelined. His protest barely made headlines, but within the army it was seen as treason. His stance revealed something deeper, that the system functioned not only because it was ordered, but because it was normalized. Soldiers were told it was the only way to win. Many believed it. Others obeyed in silence. In the villages of the interior, French troops created regroupment camps to isolate civilians from insurgents. Entire populations were relocated under armed guard. The camps soon became extensions of the same logic: surveillance, interrogation, and control. Medical teams documented malnutrition and abuse, but their reports were classified. For every FLN fighter captured, dozens of civilians were detained. The distinction between combatant and civilian disappeared, just as the distinction between interrogation and torture had. By 1960, as the war dragged on and international pressure mounted, the French state began to sense the consequences. Reports of atrocities reached the United Nations. Foreign newspapers published survivor accounts. Yet inside France, censorship remained strict. Films and books exposing torture were banned, and journalists covering the story faced trials for undermining the army's morale. The official stance was unchanged. France was conducting a counter-terrorist campaign, not a colonial war. But privately, senior officials knew what was happening. Internal memos between the Ministry of Defense and the Governor-General in Algiers referred to interrogation practices incompatible with our principles, a diplomatic code acknowledging the truth without admitting guilt. Behind closed doors, Paris tolerated the violence as long as it produced results. The secret system had become too effective, too entrenched, and too politically useful to dismantle. What no one anticipated was that the secrecy itself would become France's most enduring wound. The Republic could win battles, but it was losing its moral authority. In Algiers, in Oran, in the countryside, every beating, every disappearance was building a memory that no amnesty could erase. The system had done more than crush an insurgency. It had created a shadow that would follow France for generations. By 1961, the war in Algeria was nearing its end, but the scars it left on both nations were irreversible. France's clandestine torture system, now deeply institutionalized, had metastasized beyond the battlefield. What began as a military tactic had evolved into a culture of silence that reached the highest levels of the French Republic. The government still called the conflict les événements d'Algérie, the events in Algeria, avoiding the word war altogether. By doing so, it kept the legal shield that allowed its military to operate in the grey zone between law and brutality. Inside Algeria, French units continued to rotate through rural areas under orders to pacify. Villages were burned, men rounded up for questioning, and women used as leverage. Interrogation centers multiplied in remote garrisons, far from journalists or Red Cross observers. Torture had become so routine that logistics officers requisitioned electrical supplies specifically for questioning rooms. The field telephone, the GIGN, was as common a piece of equipment as the rifle. Soldiers joked grimly about turning up the voltage, while officers filed efficiency reports on how quickly suspects cooperated. The political leadership in Paris knew the truth, but denial was policy. Every administration, from Guy Mollet's socialist government to Charles de Gaulle's returning leadership, treated the army's methods as a necessary evil. De Gaulle himself wanted to end the war, but not by undermining the military command still loyal to him. His focus was on negotiation and withdrawal, not accountability. When the Evian Accords finally ended the conflict in 1962, France granted sweeping amnesties to all personnel, military and civilian, for acts committed during the operations of maintenance of order. Those words buried a decade of crimes beneath a legal stone. Meanwhile, the French public had begun to fracture. Reports leaked by returning conscripts painted a grim picture of systematic torture. Letters from soldiers described electric shocks, beatings, and mock executions. But others refused to believe them, arguing that the army was defending civilization against barbarism. French newspapers like Le Monde published cautious editorials, careful not to anger the government. Politicians warned that revisiting the war's darker side could destabilize the fragile new Fifth Republic. The silence was political, moral, and deeply cultural. In Algeria, independence brought little closure. For many families, victory meant freedom but not answers. Thousands of Algerians had disappeared between 1954 and 1962, taken for questioning, and never returned. The new government kept its distance from the topic, focusing on nation-building rather than the ghosts of the past. But within communities, the stories persisted. Names whispered, houses remembered, sites avoided. Some of the old interrogation centers were converted into police stations or administrative offices, their walls still bearing the stains of the war that France refused to acknowledge. A handful of French intellectuals tried to confront the silence. Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and others publicly condemned torture as a betrayal of the Republic's own ideals. "We are the torturers," Sartre wrote in Les Temps Modernes, arguing that denying state responsibility was an act of cowardice. The government responded by banning publications and charging writers with defamation. The goal was clear: to separate France from its own actions, to pretend the Republic and the army were two different entities. The truth, however, continued to leak out from within the military itself. Former officers began to publish memoirs that broke the official line. None caused as much outrage as those of General Paul Osseres's. In 2001, he openly confessed that during the Battle of Algiers, he had personally supervised torture and extrajudicial executions, and that these acts were carried out with the knowledge and approval of superiors. He claimed he had no regrets. His calm tone shocked the country more than the admissions themselves. What France had spent 40 years denying was now being described as military routine, not rogue behavior, but state policy. How Sarres's revelations forced a reckoning that the French government could no longer avoid. Historians revisited archives and found corroborating documents, telegrams, field orders, interrogation records. They showed that torture wasn't improvised chaos. It was structured, reported, and standardized. Each region had a chain of command, each operation had oversight, and detailed summaries were sent to intelligence services in Algiers and Paris. Officers used euphemisms like intensified questioning or treatment methods, but the meaning was unmistakable. The public debate that followed divided France again. Some veterans defended the army, insisting that Algeria was won thanks to harsh methods. Others, haunted by guilt, broke down in interviews, describing how they followed orders out of fear and indoctrination. A small group of Catholic clergy called for national repentance, comparing France's silence to Germany's early post-war denial. The state, however, maintained its distance. Officials repeated that excesses occurred on both sides, an equalizing phrase that blurred responsibility. The Audin case resurfaced once more as the symbol of that denial. For decades, his widow Josette had petitioned the state for truth. Every government from de Gaulle to Hollande deflected her appeals. Only in 2018 did President Emmanuel Macron finally meet her and publicly acknowledge that Audin was tortured and killed by soldiers acting under the authority of the French state. The admission, while limited, shattered 60 years of official silence. It confirmed what survivors had always said, that torture was not a crime of individuals, but a system sanctioned by the Republic itself. That gesture, however, was only the beginning. Macron's declaration opened the question of archives, tens of thousands of classified documents that could reveal how the torture apparatus functioned day by day. Historians began demanding full access, arguing that national reconciliation required transparency. The army resisted, citing secrecy laws and national interest. The bureaucracy of silence persisted long after the last soldier left Algeria. For many Algerians and French citizens, that resistance showed how deep the wound still ran. The Republic feared its own reflection. To admit the full extent of torture would mean admitting that the values of liberty and equality had been suspended, not by extremists, but by the state itself. France had fought a war for empire and lost its moral compass in the process. By the early 2000s, more testimonies emerged from both sides of the Mediterranean. Elderly veterans spoke in documentaries, sometimes tearfully, sometimes defiantly. Survivors described the sensory details of captivity, the metallic taste of electricity, the sound of generators, the smell of burnt rubber. Every story confirmed the same structure: capture, isolation, torture, disappearance. Each victim's experience fit into a larger design that historians now call the French system. The question that haunted France was no longer whether torture happened, that was beyond doubt, but how a democratic republic allowed it to become official policy, and why it took 60 years to say so. The answer lay not only in military orders, but in the psychology of empire itself. A conviction that domination could coexist with human rights, and that violence could be hidden behind patriotism. It was a delusion that defined an era and left a permanent mark on the conscience of a nation. When the Algerian War officially ended in March 1962, the Evian Accords promised peace, amnesty, and a clean slate for both nations. But peace only existed on paper. The violence, secrecy, and guilt France had buried during the war did not end with independence. They simply crossed the Mediterranean and embedded themselves in silence. The same officers who had run interrogation centers returned home to France, blending into civilian life, protected by laws that forbade prosecution for acts committed in service of national security. Files remained sealed for decades, and the torture system, though dismantled, survived as an unspoken truth. In Algeria, families searched for their missing. Some combed ravines and dry riverbeds for bones. Others wrote letters to French embassies, hoping for answers that never came. More than 3,000 people officially disappeared during the war, but the real number was likely far higher. In villages like Blida and Tlemcen, rumors persisted about hidden graves near old French posts. Bastion 18, once a fortress of interrogation, was abandoned after independence. Locals said the walls still smelled of burned flesh years later. No official investigation was ever conducted. The new Algerian state, preoccupied with rebuilding and asserting sovereignty, rarely invited outside researchers. It was as if both nations had agreed that silence was easier than truth. Meanwhile, in France, public discourse turned toward heroism and loss, but never accountability. Veterans returning from Algeria were welcomed as patriots who had fought terrorism. Television documentaries portrayed the war as a tragic clash between civilization and rebellion. Politicians avoided the subject entirely. For many, acknowledging torture meant admitting that France, the country of human rights, had violated its own moral foundation. The myth of a clean army persisted, reinforced by schoolbooks and memorials that honored the fallen but ignored the victims. Still, the truth surfaced in fragments. In the 1970s and 1980s, historians and journalists began piecing together the hidden system through testimonies, leaked memos, and court transcripts. They discovered that the torture network had functioned through a bureaucratic order as much as brute violence. Every interrogation required written authorization. Each region had liaison officers tasked with reporting results to intelligence units in Algiers. Lists of prisoners were compiled in duplicate, one version for archives, another for destruction. Reports avoided words like torture or execution, replacing them with enhanced questioning and neutralization. It was, in every sense, a state program operating beneath the mask of legality. By the 1990s, declassified military correspondence revealed that several ministers in Paris had been informed of these practices. Letters between the Minister of Defense and the colonial governor mentioned interrogation measures of exceptional rigor. Another memo discussed temporary transfers of detainees for operational use, code for secret detention. The revelations were undeniable, but no legal action could be taken. The amnesty laws still protected every participant. The system had not only been secret, it had been legally erased. For survivors, the trauma endured. Many Algerians who had been tortured were never recognized as victims. They lived with chronic pain, nightmares, and scars, both physical and psychological. Some moved to France after independence, carrying their silence with them. In working-class neighborhoods of Marseille and Lyon, old men whispered their memories to grandchildren who thought they were exaggerating. In truth, most of them had never told their full story to anyone. Speaking out could reopen wounds or, worse, invite disbelief. Inside France, the generation born after the war grew up in the shadow of omission. School curricula described the conflict as the end of the colonial era, not a war. Few learned about DOP centers, forced disappearances, or state torture. Only in 1999, 37 years after independence, did the French National Assembly officially recognize that what happened between 1954 and 1962 was indeed a war. The acknowledgement seemed symbolic, but it carried immense weight. It meant that the crimes committed were wartime actions, not policing excesses. For historians, that change cracked open the door to a long-delayed reckoning. Yet even then, the French government resisted confronting its role directly. Officials worried that acknowledging systematic torture could trigger demands for reparations or open old wounds between France and Algeria. It was not until 2018 that President Emmanuel Macron, during a visit to the widow of Maurice Audin, finally stated what no French leader before him had dared to say, that the mathematician had been tortured and killed by soldiers acting under the authority of the French state. That single phrase shattered decades of denial. Macron didn't frame it as an isolated case. He called it a system. The French Republic had officially admitted that torture had been organized, tolerated, and concealed by the state itself. The admission was groundbreaking but incomplete. Macron stopped short of issuing a national apology or extending the acknowledgement to other victims. His words were carefully chosen to limit political fallout, but historians knew what it meant. France had finally confessed to building a system of torture, not a chain of accidents. Still, many veterans and right-wing politicians protested, claiming the president had insulted the army. Some insisted that war is not morality, while others accused him of rewriting history. In Algeria, Macron's statement was met with cautious approval. Families of the disappeared saw it as vindication, though not justice. Newspapers published photos of survivors holding yellowed identification cards of missing relatives. Some called for France to return remains from unmarked graves, others demanded compensation, but above all they wanted recognition that their suffering was real and that it had a face, a method, and an author. Back in France, archives began to open slowly. Historians gained limited access to interrogation reports and field logs. Each document revealed the same patterns, the same words, same signatures, same procedures repeated across the country. What they uncovered confirmed what witnesses had said all along. The torture system had been built not by fanatics, but by bureaucrats following orders. It was paperwork, not passion, that had kept the machinery running. Still, one question haunted France's conscience. Why did it take more than half a century to admit the obvious? The answer lay in the collision between history and identity. To expose the system was to challenge the national myth of moral superiority, the idea that France, the land of Voltaire, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, could not possibly have created a network of torture chambers. The contradiction was unbearable, so it was buried. But the silence came at a cost. Every generation that avoided the subject inherited the guilt unspoken. It lingered in classrooms, in military institutions, and in the relationship between the two countries. Even after official recognition, France has never held a single public trial, never issued reparations, and never opened the full archives. The ghosts of Bastion 18 and the cellars of Algiers remain locked away in dusty files and fading memories, waiting for a country still afraid of its own reflection. By the time President Emmanuel Macron publicly acknowledged France's use of torture in 2018, the last survivors of that dark system were elderly, some nearing their 90s, others already gone. For many, the words came too late. Yet the gesture carried enormous symbolic weight. It marked the first time the French Republic formally recognized that torture in Algeria was not the work of a few individuals, but a state system. Macron's statement confirmed what witnesses, historians, and victims had been saying for decades, that France had built, maintained, and protected a secret apparatus of violence designed to suppress a population demanding its independence. Still, the admission was deliberately narrow. Macron spoke only of Maurice Audin, the mathematician whose murder had become a national emblem, and of a system that allowed torture. He did not mention the thousands of other victims, nor did he call for judicial investigations or reparations. The French government described the move as a gesture of truth and reconciliation, but in practice it was an acknowledgement without consequences. The archives remained largely closed, the perpetrators unnamed, and the victims' families still without answers. Historians who gained access to partial documents after 2018 discovered the full scale of bureaucratic involvement. Military orders referred to detainees as subjects of interest and authorized interrogations of reinforced intensity. Internal memos from intelligence services mentioned transfers without trace, a euphemism for disappearance. In one document, officers were instructed to avoid photographic evidence of operations. The paper trail revealed not chaos, but careful planning. Torture was not a desperate measure, it was institutional. France's secret torture network during the Algerian War operated with chilling precision. Dozens of centers were established across the territory: Bastion 18 in Tlemcen, the Villa Cecini in Algiers, the Château Royal in Constantine, among others. Each had designated officers trained in interrogation, medical personnel to resuscitate prisoners, and administrators to handle reports. Prisoners were rarely registered by name. Most were identified by numbers or aliases, making post-war accountability almost impossible. When operations ended, files were destroyed or coded in ways that obscured responsibility. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Many who endured torture never fully recovered. They suffered chronic anxiety, hallucinations, and lifelong physical pain. Some could not sleep without hearing the sound of electrical generators, the same ones used to deliver shocks. Families of the disappeared lived in limbo, caught between hope and despair. In Algerian culture, the missing are neither dead nor alive. They occupy a space of silence that corrodes generations. Children grew up hearing fragmented stories, uncertain which parts were real. The legacy of that fear still lingers in Algeria today. In France, a quieter form of trauma took hold among veterans and witnesses. A few who had participated in torture later confessed in old age, haunted by guilt. One officer wrote that, "We lost our humanity one confession at a time." Another admitted that, "After Algiers, I could never pray again." But for most, silence became survival. The army's code of honor demanded it, and society preferred not to listen. When filmmakers or historians tried to reopen the subject, they faced lawsuits or censorship. The 1972 film Avoir Dointon dans les oreilles and the 1992 documentary La Guerre sans nom were both criticized for tarnishing France's image. Today, the evidence of France's torture system is irrefutable, found in archives, testimonies, and declassified government papers. Yet full reckoning remains elusive. Historians continue to fight for access to military records, many of which are still sealed under national security laws. Each administration promises transparency, but moves cautiously, fearing the political implications. The French army, still proud of its legacy, resists being defined by its colonial crimes. The Ministry of Defense maintains that no useful purpose would be served by relitigating the past. In Algeria, the memory of the torture era is alive in oral history. Former detainees have recorded testimonies for universities and local museums. Some sites of detention have been turned into memorials, though many remain abandoned. On anniversaries of independence, families gather to read the names of the missing, often the only act of remembrance available to them. Younger generations raised long after the war continue to demand that France reveal the full list of secret detention sites and the fates of those who never returned. The diplomatic relationship between France and Algeria remains shadowed by this unfinished reckoning. Each attempt at reconciliation reopens the same wound, the question of acknowledgement versus accountability. France prefers to remember the end of empire as a transition to modernity. Algeria remembers it as survival through terror. Both narratives are true, and both are incomplete. The deeper truth is that France's torture system was not born of sadism, but of bureaucracy, the cold logic of a state convinced that order must be preserved at any cost. It was the product of fear, ideology, and empire. Soldiers obeyed, officers justified, politicians denied, and a nation chose not to see. What began as an exceptional measure became routine. What was done in the name of security became the greatest moral failure of the Republic's modern history. More than 6 decades later, France is still learning how to speak about that failure. The archives may one day open completely, and more names may come to light. But acknowledgement alone will never erase what was done in those cellars and camps. The legacy of the secret torture system is a warning that when a democracy hides its violence behind patriotic language, it builds ghosts that never stop haunting it. The story of France's hidden torture system is not only a chapter of history, it is a reminder of how nations choose what to remember and what to forget, and how truth, no matter how long suppressed, eventually demands to be heard.